The alarm sounds, a digital tone, precise and insistent. A hand reaches out from beneath covers to silence it. 5:30 a.m. The world outside still dark, still quiet. Inside this apartment, a ritual begins. Steam rises from the shower, filling the bathroom with warm mist. Water streams down skin, washing away sleep, but not the strange heaviness that has settled in the chest. Not quite sadness, not quite anxiety, something older, deeper, without a simple name. The bathroom mirror, clouded with condensation, gradually clears at its edges. A man appears in the frame, 30-something, his features composed into what others would recognize as success. He reaches for his razor, begins the practiced strokes across his jaw. Each movement efficient, economical, learned through thousands of repetitions. He finishes shaving, dabs his face with a towel. The motions are so familiar they've become invisible, like breathing. The mirror has cleared now, revealing his full reflection. He meets his own eyes briefly, then looks away, focusing instead on the task at hand. The closet door slides open. A row of shirts, identical except for color. A row of ties, each one selected for its ability to communicate reliability, competence, appropriateness. Never too bold, never too timid. He selects a tie, loops it around his collar. His fingers move with mechanical precision, creating the perfect knot. One might admire the skill if one didn't sense the absence behind it. These are not the movements of a man expressing himself. They are the movements of someone fulfilling an assignment. The tie is adjusted, centered, tightened. He straightens his shoulders, tilts his chin to ensure symmetry. Everything is correct. Everything is as it should be. And yet, something flickers across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition, a momentary crack in the performance. He leans closer to the mirror, studying his own features as if seeing them for the first time, or perhaps as if failing to see something that should be there. Jung would recognize this moment, the sudden awareness of persona, the social mask we construct to meet the world's expectations, not inherently false, but dangerous when mistaken for the whole truth of who we are. The persona is meant to be a bridge between our inner reality and the demands of collective life. But bridges can become walls when we forget they're meant to connect rather than separate. As he stares into his reflection, his face gradually appears foreign, not dramatically altered, but subtly estranged, like a word repeated until it loses meaning. This is the mask he has worn so long he's forgotten what lies beneath. Not a deliberate deception, but a slow forgetting, a gradual surrender to what Nietzsche called the herd instinct, the powerful evolutionary pull toward conformity that promises safety at the cost of authenticity. The mirror begins to fog again, though the shower has been off for some time. The condensation appears without reason, spreading from the edges inward, as if the glass itself were exhaling. He reaches up, wipes a clear space with his palm. But something strange happens. His reflection remains blurred, resistant to clarity, as if refusing to maintain the illusion that has governed his mornings for so many years. In this moment of disruption, a quiet voice emerges from somewhere inside him, not dramatic or demanding, but persistent, impossible to unhear once it has spoken. Who taught you to move like this? To want what you want? To fear what you fear? The question hangs in the steamy air, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. When did these gestures become his? When did these ambitions take root? When did these anxieties establish themselves as the boundaries of his world? The voice doesn't suggest there's something wrong with who he has become, only that perhaps it wasn't an entirely conscious becoming. Kierkegaard would recognize this moment as the stirring of inwardness, the beginning of the movement from what he called the aesthetic stage of existence, where life is a series of experiences to be consumed, toward the ethical stage, where one begins to take responsibility for the shape of one's own becoming. The Danish philosopher knew that this transition often begins with a sense of despair, not as emotional catastrophe, but as the recognition that something essential has been missed or avoided. The fog continues to spread across the mirror. He makes no further attempt to wipe it away. Instead, he watches as his reflection becomes increasingly obscured, features dissolving into vague outlines. There is fear in this dissolution, certainly, the fear that Nietzsche identified when he wrote of staring into the abyss. Who are we when the social definitions fall away? What remains when we step beyond the boundaries of conventional identity? But there is also a strange relief, as if some part of him has been waiting for this moment, waiting for permission to question what has long been accepted as necessary and inevitable. Schopenhauer might observe that suffering often begins with such moments of clarity, when the veil of distraction lifts and we confront the fundamental questions we've been avoiding. The German philosopher knew that pain frequently accompanies awakening, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of seeing more clearly what has always been true but carefully avoided. The man stands motionless before the clouded mirror. The perfect tie, the perfect collar, the perfect posture now seem like artifacts from a ritual whose meaning has suddenly become uncertain. Time slows in this liminal space between unconscious pattern and conscious choice. For the first time, he wonders what truth might be hiding in the obscured glass, what aspects of himself have been sacrificed to maintain the coherence of his social identity. Jung's concept of the shadow emerges here. All that has been denied or repressed to maintain the acceptable self-image. Not necessarily dark or destructive, but simply unclaimed. Potential left unrealized, questions left unasked, desires left unacknowledged. Alan Watts might smile at this moment of recognition, seeing in it the beginning of what he called the wisdom of insecurity, the understanding that the fixed self we've tried so hard to establish and defend is itself a kind of illusion. Not that we don't exist, but that we exist differently than we've imagined, more fluid, more interconnected, less defined by boundaries than we've been led to believe. The man raises his hand again, but not to clear the mirror. Instead, he places his palm against the fogged glass, leaving a print, a simple mark of presence that acknowledges both connection and separation. He is both the one who sees and the one being seen, both subject and object, both the creator of the mask and the one who has been hidden behind it. This is not a dramatic breakdown or rejection of his former life. It is a quiet opening, a small crack in the edifice of certainty, the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself through the gradual integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. He turns away from the mirror, straightens his tie one last time, not abandoning the persona, but perhaps holding it more lightly, more consciously. The day ahead will unfold much as planned. The meetings will be attended, the responsibilities met, but something has shifted internally. A question has been asked that cannot be unasked. A door has opened that cannot be fully closed again. As he leaves the bathroom, the light catches the fogged mirror, transforming it momentarily into something luminous rather than obscured. The handprint slowly disappears as the condensation evaporates. The mirror clarifies gradually, returning to its usual function. But the question remains, quiet but persistent, a companion for the journey ahead. Does he have the courage to see what lies beneath the perfect performance? And if he looks deeply enough, what might he find waiting there? Morning light spills across a city awakening to its routines. A time-lapse sequence, streets empty, then gradually filling. Traffic signals cycle from red to green to red again. Storefronts illuminate. Coffee machines hiss to life. The world assumes its familiar rhythm. We move through a cafe filled with people. The camera drifts slowly, observing without judgment. Conversations overlap, creating a tapestry of sound that feels both comforting and somehow hollow. A woman laughs a little too enthusiastically at her companion's joke. A man adjusts his posture when someone important enters. Two friends take identical photos of their breakfast, heads bent over screens, comparing filters. In every face, a subtle performance. In every gesture, an invisible audience. The scene shifts to a commuter train. Bodies pressed together in metal containers, moving through space. Eyes focused on devices or deliberately looking nowhere. Headphones creating private soundtracks for shared experiences. The camera finds a man in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression carefully calibrated to project confidence without arrogance, success without ostentation. Another mask, perfectly fitted. We learn our lines early. Speak like this, want that, pretend to be fine when you're not. Jung would call it the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the collective world. Useful armor, necessary interface between inner and outer reality. But lethal if welded to the skin, if mistaken for the whole truth of who we are. The train doors open. People stream onto platforms, into elevators, up escalators. The camera follows, observing the choreography of modern existence. The unspoken rules that govern movement, interaction, aspiration. Above this din, Nietzsche's warning echoes. The herd beckons not with chains, but with comfort. The most effective prison is the one whose bars remain invisible, whose boundaries are enforced not by guards, but by the prisoner's own desire for approval. Belonging is a warm coat in winter, a fundamental human need, a shelter against the cold indifference of existence. It is also a sedative. It dulls the edges of questions that might disrupt consensus. It softens the contours of thoughts that might set one apart. The anesthetic properties of acceptance are difficult to resist, especially when the alternative appears to be isolation. The scene transitions to a corporate office. Glass and steel, clean lines, the aesthetic of success. A meeting room where people nod in unison. The camera focuses on one woman whose expression momentarily slips, revealing doubt, perhaps, or boredom, or a flash of insight that doesn't align with the group's direction. But the moment passes. The mask returns. The nods resume. We trade questions for applause, thought for synchrony, and call it connection. The depth of our conformity is matched only by our insistence that we are thinking for ourselves. We curate our uniqueness with precision, making sure it falls within acceptable parameters, rebellious enough to feel authentic, conventional enough to ensure belonging. Yet beneath the performance, a subtle ache persists, a sense that the truth of you, the complex, contradictory, unresolved reality of your existence, is not invited to the party. The parts deemed too intense, too uncertain, too unformed remain outside, like awkward guests without an invitation. The camera moves through a modern apartment, minimal and tasteful. It lingers on a mirror hung in a dim hallway. A figure passes, you, the viewer, implicated in this narrative, and pauses to check the reflection. Everything looks almost right. The hair, the clothes, the expression all conform to what's expected. Almost. But something is missing or obscured. Some vitality has been traded for acceptance. Some authenticity has been sacrificed for safety. Kierkegaard spoke of despair as not wanting to be oneself, the desperate attempt to escape the particular nature of one's own existence. Or, conversely, as wanting to be oneself without acknowledging the ground that establishes it. The illusion of self-creation that ignores our fundamental interconnection and contingency. In the noise of contemporary life, both forms of despair thrive. We oscillate between surrendering our uniqueness for belonging and asserting a radical individualism that denies our need for community. Neither path leads to wholeness. The scene shifts to a living room bathed in the blue light of screens. The camera focuses on fingers scrolling, the endless consumption of content that provides neither nourishment nor genuine relief, just stimulus, just distraction. just enough novelty to keep boredom at bay for another moment. Schopenhauer's quiet enters like a cold wind through an open window. The more we chase distraction, the more suffering multiplies its disguises. The German philosopher understood that pain doesn't disappear when ignored. It transforms, finding new expressions, new symptoms, new ways to announce its presence. The anxiety that keeps us scrolling is both cause and effect of the scrolling itself, a perfect loop of discomfort and temporary relief that never resolves the underlying condition. Social media feeds flash across the screen, a montage of curated lives, polished opinions, performative outrage, calculated vulnerability, each image both compelling and somehow unsatisfying, creating a hunger that can never be filled by more consumption. Through this chaos of stimulus, Alan Watts whispers his Eastern-influenced wisdom. The self you perform with such exhausting diligence is merely a ripple on the surface of a deeper sea. The ego, that collection of thoughts, memories, and desires you call I, is not the totality of who you are. It's a useful fiction, a practical tool for navigating the material world. But when mistaken for the whole truth, it becomes a prison rather than a vehicle. Night falls over the city. Lights illuminate windows in countless buildings, each one representing a life, a consciousness, a unique perspective on what it means to be human. The camera pulls back, showing the vast network of connection and separation that constitutes modern existence. The visual field gradually narrows, focusing on a single window where a figure sits alone, surrounded by the artifacts of a successful life. Everything is as it should be, according to the metrics of contemporary achievement. And yet the face reveals a question forming, a doubt crystallizing. What if the life I've constructed with such care isn't actually mine? What if the voice I've cultivated isn't actually speaking my truth? It's time to turn down the volume, to create a space of silence where the noise of collective expectation can subside. It's time to learn whether there's a voice beneath the echo, a self beneath the performance, a truth beneath the comfortable lies we tell ourselves and others. The screen fades to black, but not completely. A small flame appears in the darkness, not dramatic or overwhelming, just a single point of illumination. It flickers but persists, suggesting the possibility of clarity amid confusion, of authenticity amid performance, of meaning amid noise. This is where the journey begins, not with grand revelation or dramatic rupture, but with a simple question asked in earnest. What remains when the performance ends? Who am I when no one is watching? What truth might emerge in the space between endless distraction and genuine attention? The flame grows slightly brighter. The darkness remains vast. But something has shifted. A door has opened that cannot be easily closed again. The gentle tyranny of persona has been recognized. And recognition, however subtle, contains within it the seeds of liberation. The descent into silence. A door closes, not with anger or finality, but with deliberate intention. The sound resonates in a way that feels both conclusion and beginning, the period at the end of a long sentence, the capital letter that starts a new paragraph. The world outside, with its demands and distractions, becomes suddenly distant, as if observed through thick glass. We descend into a room without windows. Sunlight enters only as thin lines at the edges of heavy curtains, creating an atmosphere that feels both shelter and confrontation. The space is simple, almost monastic. A chair, a small desk, a lamp casting a warm circle of illumination in the surrounding dimness. On the desk lies a journal, unopened. Beside it, a pen. The phone is off, not silenced, but powered down completely. No notifications will pierce this sanctuary. No algorithm will compete for attention. The door is closed. No casual intrusion will disrupt what's about to unfold. Time itself seems to shift quality, becoming less linear, more spacious. The silence feels loud, almost oppressive at first. Like entering a cathedral after a storm, the contrast between constant noise and sudden quiet creates its own kind of sound, the sound of absence, of space unfilled. The ears, accustomed to perpetual stimulus, search for something to grasp, like eyes adjusting to darkness. This is the first courage, voluntary isolation. Not misanthropy or rejection of the social world, but an experiment in essential questioning. If you remove the audience, does the actor still speak? If you eliminate external validation, what remains of what you call yourself? If you silence the constant input, what output still emerges from within? At first, the mind trembles. The withdrawal is not painless. You hear phantom applause, the ghost of social media likes, professional recognition, the subtle high of being seen and approved. You feel the imagined critique, the fear of disapproval, the anxiety of not performing according to expectation. These are not merely thoughts, but sensations in the body, the muscle memory of seeking approval that has shaped your posture, your speech, your aspirations for so long. This is withdrawal from the world's narcotic. The pleasant anesthetic of distraction and validation has been temporarily suspended, and the system protests its absence. Schopenhauer sits beside you in the dim, his presence felt not as comfort, but as clarity. The German philosopher who recognized suffering as the positive, primary fact of existence offers his sober insight. Pain sharpens where distraction ends. When we cease the constant flight from discomfort through entertainment, work, social performance, or substance, we come face to face with the fundamental anxieties we've been avoiding, the existential questions we've been too busy to entertain, the emotions we've been too afraid to feel fully. But this is the necessary incision. Just as a surgeon must cut through healthy tissue to reach what requires attention, so this discomfort serves a healing purpose. Jung calls it individuation, the gradual untangling from the collective trance, the slow differentiation of authentic self from social conditioning. To accomplish this, you must disappoint the chorus. You must risk being misunderstood, labeled difficult or selfish or strange. You must choose thinking over belonging, at least for a time. The camera frames a kettle coming to boil on a small hot plate, steam rising like thought becoming visible. It frames an open journal, a single sentence started and crossed out. It frames hands that don't know what to do without a device to hold, fingers that tap against wood in unconscious rhythm, seeking the familiar sensation of a screen. Time thickens. Minutes no longer rush past in the seamless flow of constant activity. They make themselves known, demand to be experienced, rather than merely passed through. An hour in solitude has a different texture than an hour spent scrolling. It has weight, resistance, substance. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the fog begins to thin. The initial discomfort of silence starts to transform into something else. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of pregnant stillness, a sense of potential rather than deprivation. The mind, no longer bombarded by external stimulus, begins to produce its own content, not as reaction, but as genuine creation. Nietzsche's abyss appears in this space, not as horror, but as a blank canvas. The philosopher who proclaimed the death of God understood that when traditional sources of meaning and value collapse, we face both terror and opportunity, the terrifying freedom of no script. When external authorities no longer dictate the shape of a meaningful life, the responsibility falls to each individual to create rather than merely inherit values. This is not relativism or arbitrary invention. It is the recognition that meaning must be embodied to be real, lived into rather than merely assented to. The values that sustain aren't found in abstract principles alone, but in the marriage of principle and action, belief and behavior, vision and practical commitment. Kierkegaard's paradox whispers through the quiet room. To become yourself, you must leap without proof. The Danish existentialist understood that authentic existence requires commitment in the absence of certainty, the willingness to bind oneself to values, to relationships, to purposes without guarantee that they will succeed or endure. This is not recklessness, but the mature recognition that certainty is not available for life's most important decisions. We cannot know in advance that the path we choose is the right one. We can only move forward with sincerity and attention, allowing meaning to emerge from engagement rather than from abstract calculation of outcomes. In this room without windows, solitude reveals itself not as absence, but as presence, the presence of a life unmediated by others' eyes, not the absence of connection, but the presence of a different kind of relationship, your consciousness in direct contact with existence, without the buffer of social performance or digital distraction. The pen finally moves across the journal page, hesitant at first, then with increasing flow. Not because someone is watching, not because it will be shared or evaluated, but because expression itself has value, because the articulation of thought is a fundamental human need, not merely a social transaction. Alan Watts smiles at the edge of the frame, his Eastern-influenced perspective offering a shift in vantage point. Perhaps you are not a separate self, learning to be alone, but the space in which all of this appears. Thoughts, sensations, emotions rising and falling like waves on an ocean that remains unchanged by their movement. This is not mystical escapism, but a practical recognition that much of our suffering comes from over-identification with temporary mental states, from mistaking the weather for the sky itself. The self that seems so solid, so in need of constant defense and enhancement, might be more fluid and open than our cultural conditioning has led us to believe. The camera pulls back slowly, revealing the simple room as both physical space and internal reality. The boundaries between inner and outer experience begin to blur, not in confusion, but in recognition of their fundamental unity. The self being discovered in solitude is not separate from the world it inhabits. It is in constant conversation with that world, shaped by and shaping it through every action, every choice, every moment of attention or inattention. The decision to disappear from social visibility is really the decision to meet what remains when the performance ends, to encounter what persists when the constant stimulation ceases, to discover what is essential rather than merely habitual in your way of being. Night deepens outside the curtained windows. The lamp's circle of light seems to intensify rather than diminish against the growing darkness. The journal pages are no longer empty. The kettle has cooled. The initial resistance to solitude has transformed into a different kind of engagement, not frantic distraction, but focused attention. Not flight from discomfort, but the courage to remain present with whatever arises. This is not the end of the journey, but its true beginning. The withdrawal from noise creates space for a more authentic signal to emerge. The temporary separation from others allows for a deeper kind of connection later, one based on genuine presence rather than performance, on shared humanity rather than shared distraction. The silence that once felt oppressive now feels like clarity. The solitude that once felt like deprivation now feels like foundation. The room without windows has revealed itself not as prison, but as chrysalis, the protected space where transformation can occur before re-emergence into the wider world. Confronting the shadow. The path narrows, light diminishes. You stand at the mouth of a cave, an opening in stone that seems both invitation and warning. The entrance is neither large nor imposing. It would be easy to pass by without noticing. Most do. The comfortable path continues elsewhere, well marked and populated. This detour requires deliberate choice. You step inside. The temperature drops immediately. The sounds of the outside world fade, replaced by the subtle drip of water on stone, the echo of your own breathing. This is not a touristic cave with designated paths and convenient lighting. This is the raw, unmediated underworld, dark, quiet, honest. This is where the shadow waits. The denied, the envied, the feared, the unclaimed. Everything you've pushed away to maintain a coherent identity. Everything deemed too dangerous or contradictory for your carefully constructed self-image. Jung understood that the psyche, like nature, abhors a vacuum. What consciousness rejects doesn't disappear. It descends into the unconscious, gathering energy and autonomy the longer it remains unacknowledged. The camera moves slowly through the darkness, revealing glimpses rather than panoramas. A stone wall glistening with moisture, a narrow passage requiring you to bend, to humble yourself before proceeding. The sound of your footsteps, hesitant at first, then more deliberate as your eyes adjust to the minimal light. Jung's mirror awaits in this underground chamber, not a surface mirror that shows only appearance, but a depth mirror that reveals what lies beneath the presentation. What you see here will not flatter you. It will not confirm the story you've been telling about who you are and why you do what you do. But it offers something more valuable than flattery, the possibility of wholeness. The camera finds old memory script pinned to stone, fragments of your history preserved in this underworld. A small betrayal, the time you abandoned a friend because their struggle made you uncomfortable. Swallowed anger, the righteous rage you suppressed because expressing it might cost you acceptance. A laugh that didn't belong to you, the time you joined mockery of someone different because belonging to the group felt more important than honoring your own values. These are not dramatic revelations of evil or malice. In the darkness, truth is less dramatic than you feared, and more difficult. Simple facts about who you have been and what you have avoided. Not evidence of your irredeemable nature, but documentation of your humanity. Your vulnerability to social pressure, your fear of rejection, your capacity for both compassion and cruelty. Solitude amplifies these recognitions. Without the crowd's distraction, without the constant noise of external validation and stimulus, emotions emerge with startling clarity. Envy feels like a knot in the chest, a physical tension that accompanies the thought of someone else's success or attribute. Resentment manifests as a stale room, an enclosed space where the same grievances circulate endlessly without fresh air. Fear appears as a hand on the throat, the constriction of possibility, the limitation of breath, the reduction of life's fullness to mere survival. The impulse to flee is strong, to return to light and noise and the comforting numbness of distraction. But stay. Look longer. The shadow contains not only difficulty, but fuel. What you've denied isn't only your weakness, but often your strength, aspects of your potential too powerful to be accommodated by your current self-concept or social role. What you hated in others often hides an exiled part of your own capacity. The judgment you broadcast with such certainty was frequently a map back to the talent you didn't allow yourself to develop, the desire you didn't permit yourself to acknowledge, the power you were afraid to claim. Nietzsche suggests the monster you fear has your face because it is your power, unrefined. The German philosopher who invited us to look beyond conventional morality understood that what society deems good often serves the maintenance of mediocrity, while what it condemns as evil sometimes contains the seeds of transformation and creative force. This is not an invitation to amorality or cruelty, but to a more nuanced understanding of human potential. The shadow isn't evil. It is energy that hasn't found appropriate expression. It becomes destructive only when denied, only when forced to operate outside conscious direction. Kierkegaard nods from the darkness. Despair is the refusal to become what you are meant to become. The Danish existentialist recognized that our deepest suffering often stems not from external circumstances, but from our resistance to our own authentic becoming, from the gap between what we are and what we have the potential to be. The cave narrows further. The path descends. This is not lateral movement, but vertical, a journey downward into deeper layers of self. The camera tracks your breathing, which has changed rhythm. No longer the shallow, rapid pattern of anxiety, but the slower, deeper pattern of engagement. The pen moves across journal pages, illuminated by the small light you've brought. You write names, people you've wronged, people you've envied, people you've feared. You write apologies, not performative ones designed to elicit forgiveness, but honest acknowledgments of harm done. You write refusals, boundaries you will no longer cross, compromises you will no longer make, lies you will no longer tell yourself or others. You reclaim old promises not kept, the commitment to creative work abandoned because someone said it wasn't practical, the relationship not pursued because it didn't fit your social circle's expectations, the path not taken because it involved too much uncertainty. These broken promises to yourself weren't failures of character, but failures of courage. Moments when the pull of belonging overcame the pull of becoming. Schopenhauer's silence now feels medicinal, like a winter that kills the pests. The German philosopher who advocated solitude as essential for genuine thought would recognize this moment, when the absence of distraction allows for a clearer perception of reality, even when that reality includes pain. The difficulty of this confrontation serves a healing purpose. The discomfort is not punishment but purification. In the cave, honesty hurts, but it does not humiliate, it dignifies. There is a peculiar kind of relief in finally acknowledging what you have always, at some level, known to be true. The shadow material loses some of its power once brought into consciousness. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes available for integration rather than continuing its autonomous and often destructive activity from the unconscious. Water drips from stone, a steady metronome marking time in this timeless space. The camera pulls back, revealing the cave as both physical location and psychological territory, the underworld not as mythic abstraction, but as lived experience. This journey isn't separate from daily life. It is its foundation. What happens in this darkness determines what becomes possible in the light. And in this difficult reckoning, a new outline of self starts to appear. Not a perfect self, not an idealized self, not a self free from contradiction or limitation, but a more honest self, a more integrated self, a self capable of greater authenticity precisely because it no longer needs to maintain the fiction of its own perfection or coherence. Jung would recognize this as a crucial stage in individuation, the process through which we become more fully ourselves by incorporating what has been denied or rejected. Not transcendence of our humanity, but full embodiment of it, with all its complexity and contradiction. The cave is not the end of the journey. It is a necessary passage, a transformation point, a place where old identities dissolve so that more authentic ones can emerge. What awaits beyond this darkness isn't perfection or permanent resolution, but greater capacity for honesty, for creativity, for genuine connection with others based on shared humanity rather than shared pretense. You gather what you've written, what you've discovered, what you've reclaimed. These aren't pleasant souvenirs, but essential provisions for the journey ahead. The path begins to rise again, gradually leading back toward the surface. The light at the entrance appears, not as blinding revelation, but as gentle invitation. You move toward it, changed by what the darkness has revealed. Not completed, not perfected, but more integrated. Not finished with the shadow, but better equipped to work with its energy rather than against it. The cave remains, always accessible, always necessary for continued growth. But for now, the ascent calls. The world awaits, not as threat, but as context. The field in which your more honest, more complete self will now express itself. Mapping your territory. The path emerges from the cave, winding upward through ancient trees. We step into a forest at dusk, that liminal hour when light and shadow intermingle, when boundaries between worlds grow porous. Mist rises from the earth, curling around trunks and stones like questions taking physical form. Branches reach overhead like neural networks, complex and interconnected, creating patterns both random and ordered. This is not wilderness as chaos, but wilderness as complexity, a living system with its own intelligence, its own wisdom. The camera moves slowly through this environment, revealing textures of bark and leaf, the subtle variations of green fading to blue in the diminishing light. Sound is minimal, the occasional rustle of unseen creatures, the distant call of birds settling for night, the soft percussion of your footsteps on earth and fallen needles. The task that presents itself here is mapping. Not the world as objective territory, that has been done, excessively perhaps, with satellites and global positioning systems reducing mystery to data points. No, this is mapping of a different kind, the cartography of your world, your internal landscape with its unique features and contours, values that give weight and direction to choice, boundaries that define where you end and others begin. Desires that felt unmentionable in the harsh light of collective judgment, but which might speak essential truths about who you are and what you need to become. Jung's concept of the self emerges in this forest, not the ego with its concerns about status and approval, but the deeper center of psychic wholeness that contains all contradictions without being diminished by them. This is not a treasure to be discovered intact, like archaeological remains or buried gold. It is assembled through fidelity to what shows itself in solitude, through the gradual integration of conscious and unconscious material, through the honest recognition of both light and shadow aspects of your nature. The camera focuses on hands unfolding a blank sheet of paper against the trunk of a fallen tree, the emptiness of the page both invitation and challenge. How do you map terrain that shifts with every choice, every insight, every encounter? How do you represent a landscape that includes not only what is, but what might be, the potential that exists alongside the actual? You begin by placing markers, simple symbols that indicate, this strengthens me, this depletes me, this is merely expected of me, neither nourishing nor authentic. The hand moves across the paper with increasing confidence, not because certainty grows, but because the value of the attempt becomes clearer than the need for perfection. Here, in this mist-filled forest, thinking and belonging meet in a quiet debate, not as external forces, but as internal voices that have shaped your choices, often without conscious recognition. Belonging pleads, soften your voice, round your edges, make yourself compatible with what others can easily recognize and accept. The pain of exclusion is too great, the warmth of acceptance too necessary. Compromise is not weakness, but wisdom. Thinking answers, speak clearly or not at all. Your uniqueness is not an inconvenience to be minimized, but a gift to be offered. Clarity may cost you easy belonging, but it grants you authentic connection, with yourself first, and then with others capable of meeting you in that authenticity. Compromise on expression is compromise on perception, and perception is the foundation of all meaningful action. This debate does not resolve neatly. It continues as background music to the mapping process. The tension between these voices is not a problem to solve, but a dynamic to engage, a creative friction that generates both heat and light when approached with consciousness. Nietzsche's call returns in this twilight space, less thunderous now than when first encountered, more intimate. Create your meaning. The German philosopher who declared the death of God understood that when traditional sources of meaning and value collapse, the responsibility falls to each individual to generate rather than merely inherit values, not through arbitrary invention or mere preference, but through deep alignment with what genuinely matters from the perspective of lived experience. This is not a denial of reality, but a chosen interpretation, a style of being that acknowledges both the constraints of existence and the freedom to assign significance within those constraints. Not there are no facts, only interpretations, as superficial relativism might suggest, but facts require interpretation to become meaningful in human terms. The map begins to show patterns. Certain activities, relationships, environments consistently nourish. Others consistently deplete. The correlation isn't always what conventional wisdom would predict. What should bring joy sometimes brings emptiness. What should feel like sacrifice sometimes brings unexpected fulfillment. The map honors experience over expectation, actual response over theoretical prediction. Kierkegaard offers the paradox of commitment as this mapping continues. Freedom is not the absence of bonds, but the courage to bind oneself to what is worthy. The Danish existentialist understood that unlimited possibility without commitment leads not to liberation but to anxiety, the vertigo of infinite options without direction or purpose. True freedom manifests not in keeping all doors perpetually open, but in choosing which doors to walk through with full awareness and acceptance of what that choice entails. The camera pulls back to show the forest in wider perspective. The interplay of vegetation and space, density and clearing, growth and decay. Schopenhauer's sober wisdom enters this vista. Life remains difficult. Let it be. The German philosopher's recognition of suffering as intrinsic to existence wasn't an invitation to despair, but to clear-eyed engagement with reality as it is rather than as we might wish it to be. In hardship, the map acquires contour. Without friction, everything is a bland meadow, undifferentiated, lacking the variation that makes navigation possible and meaningful. It is precisely the challenges, the obstacles, the difficulties that create the landmarks by which we orient ourselves in both external and internal territories. The forest begins to open to a clearing. Light increases, not dramatically, but noticeably. Alan Watts appears in this transitional space, not as physical presence, but as perspective, as invitation to shift vantage point. The Western philosopher who so effectively translated Eastern wisdom offers his central insight. Perception is a lens. Clean it, and the world brightens. The fundamental nature of reality doesn't change, but our relationship to it transforms dramatically when we recognize how our perceptual filters, our accumulated assumptions, our cultural conditioning shapes what we see and how we interpret it. The illusion wasn't that life is real. It was that the performance was necessary, that our social masks were more essential than the consciousness behind them, that approval mattered more than authenticity, that security mattered more than truth. You continue the mapping process, sketching rituals like trail signs, practices that will maintain the clarity glimpsed in this forest when you return to the noise and speed of collective life. Morning pages, the daily practice of writing without censorship or agenda, allowing the authentic voice to strengthen through regular exercise. Long walks without devices, movement that clarifies thought, solitude that clarifies feeling. Deliberate work, creation driven by internal necessity rather than external validation. Deliberate rest, renewal that honors the natural rhythms of energy and attention rather than forcing continual productivity. These aren't grand commitments or dramatic transformations. They are modest practices, humble habits, but with profound potential for maintaining connection with the deeper currents of meaning beneath the surface noise of contemporary existence. As these markers accumulate on the map, the fog thins further. The forest does not become simple. It remains complex, mysterious, sometimes challenging, but it becomes navigable. The difference between a threatening wilderness and an environment that can be traversed isn't the absence of difficulty, but the presence of orientation, knowing which way is forward, which path leads home, which landmarks indicate progress or regression. The map is not reality itself, but a useful representation, a tool for engagement rather than a substitute for direct experience. Its value lies not in perfection or comprehensiveness, but in practical utility, in the increased capacity for movement with intention rather than mere reaction. Night begins to fall in earnest. The clearing remains visible, but its edges blur into deepening shadow. The map is folded carefully, placed in a pocket close to the heart. This work is not finished. The territory will continue to reveal itself. The map will require ongoing revision and refinement. But something essential has been established. A relationship with your own experience that honors its particular contours rather than forcing it into predetermined forms. Power begins to feel different in this forest, not like domination or control over others, not like the frantic energy of constant achievement or acquisition. It begins to feel like quiet competence, the ability to navigate complexity without panic, to make choices from center rather than periphery, to create meaning through engagement rather than impose it through will. The camera pulls back further, showing the forest, the clearing, and your figure within it, part of this living system, influenced by it, contributing to it, inseparable from it in countless ways. But also distinct, also unique, also capable of conscious choice within the web of interconnection, not isolated but individuated, not separated but clarified, not lost but increasingly, deliberately, home. The sculptor's flame. We enter a stone room, ancient, solid, austere. The walls have witnessed centuries, bearing silent testimony to human presence and absence across time. No windows interrupt the stone. A single wooden door stands closed, separating this space from the outside world. In the center burns a single candle. Not an electric simulation, but actual fire. A living flame that transforms matter into light. The camera circles this flame slowly, revealing its constant movement. It dances, shifts, responds to invisible currents. Yet despite this continuous motion, it maintains its essential nature. The flame moves, but it doesn't panic. This is will, reimagined. Not the exhausting, clenched jaw striving of modern productivity culture, but Nietzsche's deeper understanding. The will to become, to shape, to say yes to the sculptor's chisel. The philosopher saw beyond simplistic notions of willpower as brute force. He recognized a more refined capacity, the alignment with one's deepest nature and persistence in that alignment, despite opposition or temporary failure. The camera reveals more. A simple desk, a chair, a bed with plain coverings, a shelf holding few, carefully chosen books, nothing excessive, everything intentional. This is concentration as power, the elimination of distraction in service of depth. Isolation has given you this workshop, not isolation as permanent condition, but as creative context. The withdrawal from social noise has created space in which genuine work can begin. Not work measured by external metrics, but work as transformation, the gradual shaping of self according to internal vision rather than external demand. Now you begin the carving. The camera tracks your daily labors. The page written not for audience but for clarity, each sentence an attempt to articulate truth rather than impress. The physical practice performed not for show but for mastery. Movements repeated until they become embodied knowledge. The conversation refused not from fear, but from recognition that it would cost too much soul, would require a compromise of authenticity too damaging to justify. These practices appear mundane. They lack the drama of grand gestures. They unfold in privacy, in the kind of sustained attention our culture has made increasingly rare. Yet in their accumulation, they constitute an alchemy, transforming potential into actual, possibility into reality. Jung's concept of integration gathers heat here, like metal softening in a forge. The psychologist understood that wholeness doesn't come from eliminating unwanted aspects of self. It comes from incorporating all that we are, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, into a more complete identity that holds contradiction without fragmentation. Shadow is not banished. It is metabolized into strength. Anger becomes boundary, the healthy capacity to say no to what diminishes. Envy becomes aspiration, the recognition of genuine desire beneath social comparison. Fear becomes vigilance, appropriate caution navigating risk without paralysis. The flame flickers as if responding to these transformations. Its light creates moving shadows, a dance of illumination and darkness that visualizes psychic integration. Not the elimination of shadow, but a changed relationship to it. Not absence of darkness, but recognition of its role in defining light. Kierkegaard's faith arrives with no trumpet or dramatic revelation. It arrives simply as the decision to move as if your chosen meaning is real, to act with commitment despite the absence of external guarantees. The existentialist recognized that authentic existence requires this leap, not denying reason, but acknowledging reason's limits, the gap between what can be proven and what must be lived. This is not delusion. It is responsibility, the willingness to respond to life as it presents itself rather than waiting for certainty. You become accountable, not to external authority, but to the vows you made in the forest, to the map of your internal territory, to the vision of selfhood glimpsed in moments of clarity. The camera returns to the flame, steady despite movement. Schopenhauer doesn't leave. Suffering remains a fundamental condition. But it stops being personal, stops feeling like punishment, stops generating the secondary suffering of resistance. Pain becomes weather. You are the place that endures and grows in it. His sober recognition of life's difficulty becomes not pessimism, but clarity, foundation for genuine action rather than escapism. Alan Watts's perspective enters like a gentle breeze. His wisdom softens Western individualism's edges without abandoning its insights. Control is limited, participation is vast. The illusion of the separate self-controlling external reality yields to a perception of interdependence, of being part of a complex system rather than apart from it, of influencing rather than determining. The flame is steady because it doesn't fight the air, it dances with it. It maintains its nature not through rigid resistance, but through supple responsiveness that preserves essence while allowing form to shift. This is not weakness. It is the higher strength that comes from alignment with reality, from working with conditions rather than battling against them. Time passes differently here. Not the frenetic pace of contemporary life with its constant interruptions, but the slower rhythm of genuine creation, of work requiring sustained attention, of transformation that cannot be rushed, of growth following its own timeline rather than imposed schedules. The camera pulls back, revealing the room as both physical space and internal reality. Here, isolation ceases to be against the world and becomes for something. Craftsmanship of self, clarity of aim, a quiet, patient yes to becoming. Not rejection of connection, but temporary withdrawal for the sake of offering something genuine upon return. This is what Nietzsche gestured toward with his Übermensch, not a superhuman dominating others, but an integrated human taking responsibility for creating meaning where traditional values have collapsed. Not transcendence of humanity, but full embodiment of it. Not escape from the human condition, but deeper engagement with it. The candle burns lower but remains steady. Your face in its light shows subtle transformation, less tension, less performance, more presence, more congruence between inner reality and outer expression. This is not completion. The sculptor never finishes entirely. There is always more refinement possible, more truth to reveal. But something essential has shifted. The work now proceeds from centered intention rather than anxious striving, from authentic vision rather than external expectation. The flame dances with the air, steady in essence despite movement. In that balance of stability and response, a different kind of strength takes shape, one that endures precisely because it doesn't exhaust itself in rigid resistance to what is. Return to the world. We open on the city again. Same streets, same buildings, same rhythms of traffic and commerce. But something has shifted. not the external environment, but the lens through which it's perceived. The camera moves through familiar spaces with an unfamiliar gaze, more deliberate, more attentive, less anxious. You step back into the stream of urban life, joining the flow of bodies moving through subway stations, office buildings, cafes. But you do not dissolve into this collective movement. There is a quality of presence that remains distinct, not separate or opposed, but maintaining its essential nature while participating in the larger pattern. This is individuation's paradoxical grace. You belong without surrendering. Jung understood that genuine individuation doesn't lead to isolation or narcissistic self-absorption. It leads to more authentic participation, connection based on actual presence rather than performance, on genuine exchange rather than strategic positioning. The persona returns as you navigate social situations, the professional demeanor in meetings, the casual tone with friends, the focused attention with family. But it returns not as a mask fused to the face, not as a desperate attempt to secure approval or avoid rejection, but as a tool held lightly. There is a subtle difference visible in your eyes, in the set of your shoulders, in the quality of your attention. The difference between wearing a mask that conceals and employing a persona that facilitates. Conversations are slower now, answers shorter. Not from coldness or detachment, but from a reluctance to fill space with words that don't carry meaning, to offer responses before understanding has formed. The pauses between sentences have expanded, no longer experienced as awkward gaps to be filled, but as spaces where thought can deepen, where genuine connection can form. We see you decline an invitation, not with apology or excuse, but with simple clarity. The event would blur your outline, would require a return to the old performance, would cost more than it would offer. This refusal isn't motivated by fear or avoidance, but by fidelity to the map drawn in forest solitude, by commitment to the self shaped in that stone room. Later, we see you accept a different invitation, one that resonates with your authentic interests, that allows for genuine exchange, that deepens rather than dilutes your sense of self. This is the social artistry of boundaries, not walls that isolate, but permeable membranes that allow discernment about what enters and what doesn't, what merits engagement and what doesn't. The camera follows you through a crowded event, perhaps a gallery opening or a professional gathering. Nietzsche's herd still sings its chorus of conformity. The subtle pressures to think, speak, and behave in collectively approved ways remain powerful. But you hear the key, not the command. You recognize the music without feeling compelled to dance to it. A colleague offers an opinion with absolute certainty, expecting automatic agreement. You listen without reflexive nodding, without performative mirroring of their conviction. You respond not with opposition or argument, but with a question that opens rather than closes the conversation, that invites deeper consideration rather than mere agreement or disagreement. You recognize projection without swallowing it. When someone attributes motives to your actions that reflect their fears more than your intentions, you don't absorb their interpretation as truth. You don't defend against it as attack. You hold it as information about their perception without allowing it to define your reality. Jung's concept of the self sits quietly behind your eyes, not the ego with its concerns about status and validation, but the deeper center of psychic wholeness that contains all contradictions without being diminished by them. This is the inner witness that doesn't bargain for approval, that doesn't require external confirmation to know its own nature. The camera moves through a series of social interactions, each revealing this new capacity to be in the world without being defined by it, to engage without being consumed, to connect without being absorbed. This isn't perfect or complete. There are still moments of old patterns, still situations that trigger automatic responses. But there is a growing capacity to notice these moments, to create space between stimulus and reaction, to choose response rather than merely enact conditioning. Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith would smile at this development. You act in the world as if your inward commitment is enough, because it is. The Danish existentialist understood that authentic existence requires this paradoxical stance, being fully engaged in temporal reality while simultaneously holding to values and meanings that transcend immediate circumstances, not escaping the world, but bringing something essential to it. Not rejecting ordinary life, but infusing it with extraordinary consciousness. A setback occurs, a project fails, a relationship ends, an opportunity disappears. Schopenhauer offers his sober mercy in this moment. Expect neither applause nor fairness. Offer your craft anyway. The German philosopher's recognition of life's inherent difficulty becomes not a source of bitterness or despair, but of clarity and resilience. Suffering doesn't disappear, but it loses its power to define your identity or determine your actions. It becomes context rather than content, weather rather than climate. And through it all, Alan Watts leans in with his gentle reminder. Separation was always partial. You are distinct, not divided. The Eastern-influenced philosopher understood that the boundaries between self and world are both real and constructed, necessary for functioning, but ultimately permeable, defining, but not absolute. This insight doesn't collapse boundaries or erase difference. It doesn't lead to a formless mysticism that denies the practical realities of embodied existence. Instead, it places boundaries in proper perspective, as useful but provisional, as tools rather than ultimate truths. You are a particular expression of life, not an entity separate from life. The camera shows your bathroom mirror again. Same frame, different face. Not dramatically altered in features, but transformed in quality. There is less tension, less effort to maintain a particular image, less anxiety about how you might be perceived. There is more presence, more integration between internal experience and external expression, more comfort with the face that meets your gaze. The power discovered in isolation reveals itself not as domination or control, but as coherence. The capacity to maintain essential nature across contexts, to remain centered amid changing circumstances, to act from authentic values rather than reactive patterns. You have learned to shut them out so that when you let them in, you do so by choice, with discernment about what serves genuine connection and what merely perpetuates performance. The void you once feared, the emptiness you imagined would remain if social validation were removed, if constant distraction were eliminated, if comfortable illusions were abandoned, has transformed into something else entirely. It is now experienced as spaciousness around your actions, as the clearing where real connection can happen, unhurried, unperformed, unafraid. The camera pulls back from the mirror, showing you moving through your morning routine. The mechanical precision of earlier days has been replaced by something more fluid, more present, more conscious. Not dramatic or performative consciousness, but simple attention to what is actually happening rather than to imagined evaluation or comparison. You step outside into morning light. The city continues its rhythm, traffic flows, pedestrians move along sidewalks, commerce proceeds. Nothing external has changed dramatically, but your relationship to it has shifted in subtle, essential ways. You move through these familiar spaces neither as rebel nor as conformist, neither rejecting collective life nor surrendering to it, neither isolated in rigid individuality nor dissolved in unconscious collectivity. This is not arrival at a perfect state of being. The work continues. The capacity to maintain this consciousness requires ongoing attention, ongoing practice. Old patterns still emerge, still exert their pull. But there is now a growing ability to recognize them when they appear, to create space around them rather than being captured by them, to choose response rather than merely react. The camera follows as you greet a neighbor, as you enter a cafe, as you begin your day's work. In each interaction, there is a quality of presence that wasn't there before, not dramatic or demanding attention, but quietly transformative. This presence isn't something you do, it's something you allow. It emerges not from effort, but from the removal of obstacles, not from acquisition, but from recognition of what was always there beneath the performance, the distraction, the fear. As the sequence ends, we see you pausing briefly on a busy street corner. The city flows around you, cars passing, people moving, life proceeding in all its complexity and contradiction. You stand in this flow not as something separate from it, not as something above or below it, but as conscious participation in the pattern, distinct but connected, individual but not isolated, unique but not divided. This is not the end of the journey, but its true beginning. The return to the world, with the awareness gained in solitude, the engagement with collective life informed by individual insight, the participation in society enriched by the courage to sometimes stand apart from it. Not perfect or complete, but authentic. Not arrived, but consciously becoming. The daily revolt morning light filters through trees, creating patterns of gold and shadow on a forest floor. Fog lingers between trunks but is slowly dissipating, revealing more of the landscape with each passing moment. The path ahead winds through this emerging clarity, not straight or predictable, but navigable. We see a figure walking this path, unhurried yet purposeful. This is not escape, it is orientation, the regular return to what grounds and centers before engaging with what scatters and fragments. The scene shifts to a desk at night. A single lamp casts its steady illumination, creating a circle of light amid surrounding darkness. Papers, books, a journal open to a half-filled page. The hand that writes moves deliberately, not with the frantic energy of deadline or obligation, but with the patient attention of ritual. This is not performance for external evaluation. It is conversation with oneself, the dialogue between consciousness and emerging understanding that requires no audience. We pan outward from this intimate scene to a wide shot of city lights seen from distance, thousands of illuminated windows forming patterns like earthbound constellations, each light representing a life, a consciousness, a unique perspective on what it means to be human. The camera moves gradually from this expansive view back to specific detail, your face reflected in a window, observing this living network of connection and separation with both participation and perspective. This is not a grand revolution announced with manifestos and marches. It is a daily, almost invisible revolt against dilution, against the gradual erosion of depth and distinction that occurs when we surrender too completely to collective patterns without question or resistance. Not rejection of community, but refusal to be unconsciously defined by it. Not isolation from others, but insistence on bringing something genuine to the exchange. Your rituals are small but obstinate. Solitude before screens, the commitment to begin each day in conversation with yourself rather than with the collective noise of information and opinion. Creation before consumption, the discipline to generate from internal resources before filling with external content. Reflection before response, the pause that allows reaction to mature into reply, that creates space between stimulus and speech, that values accuracy over immediacy. The flame kindled in that stone room is maintained, not worshipped. This is not self-absorption or narcissistic preoccupation with personal development. It is recognition that what you bring to the world, your perspective, your creativity, your presence, requires certain conditions to develop and sustain, not rigid protection of fragile ego, but practical stewardship of genuine capacity. Jung's counsel endures through these daily practices. Keep integrating. There is always more shadow, always more gold locked inside it. The Swiss psychologist understood that individuation is not an achievement, but a process, not a destination, but a journey that continues as long as consciousness persists. The aspects of self initially recognized in that cave exploration were not the totality of what waits to be acknowledged and incorporated. New challenges will activate new shadows. New growth will reveal new potential. The camera shows you pausing in conversation when defensiveness arises, not pushing it away, not surrendering to it, but noticing it with curiosity. What threatened truth does this reaction protect? What disowned strength might this irritation contain? What aspect of self previously rejected might be requesting recognition and integration? Nietzsche's challenge persists alongside this Jungian work. Keep creating values in the face of flux. The German philosopher who proclaimed the death of God understood that when traditional sources of meaning collapse, the responsibility falls to each individual to generate rather than merely inherit values, not through arbitrary invention or mere preference, but through deep alignment with what genuinely matters from the perspective of lived experience. We see you making choices that reflect this commitment to created rather than merely inherited meaning, declining participation in activities that others insist. Everyone enjoys, pursuing interests that generate genuine curiosity rather than social cachet speaking truth that risks disapproval when integrity requires it. Not rebellion for its own sake, but fidelity to authentic valuation despite external pressure. Schopenhauer's realism grounds these choices: accept the weather of suffering and build anyway. The philosopher who recognized pain as intrinsic to existence offers not escape, but perspective, the understanding that difficulty is not exception, but condition, not punishment, but context. This recognition doesn't eliminate suffering, but it removes the secondary suffering of resistance and complaint, the energy wasted in protesting what simply is. The camera finds you encountering disappointment, loss, the inevitable friction of existence, and meeting these experiences not with surprise or outrage, but with the steady presence that acknowledges reality without being diminished by it. Not resignation or defeat, but the strength that comes from seeing clearly rather than through the distorting lens of how things should be. Kierkegaard's paradox accompanies each choice you make. Act without guarantees. The Danish existentialist understood that authentic existence requires commitment in the absence of certainty. The willingness to bind oneself to values, to relationships, to purposes without proof that they will succeed or endure. This is not recklessness, but the mature recognition that certainty is not available for life's most significant decisions. We observe you making such a choice, perhaps investing in work whose outcome cannot be predicted, perhaps extending trust that might not be reciprocated, perhaps expressing truth whose reception cannot be controlled. Not with naive optimism that ignores potential consequences, but with the clear-eyed courage that accepts risk as the price of authentic engagement. And through it all, Watt's laughter reminds you not to take your seriousness too seriously. The game is profound because it is playful. The Western philosopher who so effectively translated Eastern wisdom understood that excessive earnestness often indicates ego attachment rather than genuine depth, that the truly profound includes lightness alongside gravity, play alongside purpose. We glimpse this quality in unexpected moments of humor, in the capacity to laugh at your own patterns without dismissing their importance, in the willingness to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them prematurely. Not frivolity that avoids depth, but the playfulness that comes from recognizing the constructed nature of much we take for absolute. Thinking and belonging will always wrestle within human experience. Let them. Their tension is not a problem to solve, but a dynamic to engage, a creative friction that generates both warmth and illumination when approached with consciousness. Never let belonging do your thinking. Never surrender discernment for the sake of acceptance. Never exchange perception for protection. And never let thinking make you unkind. Never use insight as weapon. Never mistake analysis for understanding. Never allow intellectual clarity to become emotional disconnection. The camera settles on your face as you open a door, not to flee the world in rejection or fear, but to meet it with full presence. The journey through isolation was never about permanent separation. You shut them out to hear yourself, to create the conditions where authentic voice could emerge from beneath the accumulated layers of performance and adaptation. You return so this true voice can be heard, so that what was discovered in solitude can be offered in connection. In a culture addicted to noise, your silence is not absence. It is signal. In an environment saturated with stimulus, your selectivity is not limitation. It is discernment. In a context that values constant visibility, your periodic disappearance is not irrelevance. It is renewal. This is the power to choose what enters, which voices you allow to shape your thinking, which demands you permit to claim your time, which perspectives you invite to influence your perception. And it is the power to choose what does not enter, which distractions you decline, which expectations you release, which projections you allow to pass without absorption. And in that choice, that ongoing, renewable choice, to become someone no crowd could ever assemble for you. Not because you reject collective wisdom or communal connection, but because you recognize that the most valuable contribution you can make to any community is the perspective that comes from genuine individuation rather than mere adaptation. The final image, you stepping fully into morning light, face turned toward the day's possibilities, eyes clear and present. Not perfect or complete, not finished or fixed, but engaged in the continuous process of becoming more fully what you are, more conscious, more integrated, more authentic in both solitude and connection. This is not the end. There is no end to this work as long as consciousness continues. But there is the ongoing invitation to live from center rather than periphery, from depth rather than surface, from genuine presence rather than habitual performance. And in accepting that invitation, day after day, choice after choice, moment after moment, something essential is both preserved and offered, a unique perspective, an authentic voice, a singular way of being human in a world that needs precisely this contribution.